The portrayal of Malkoçoğlu Bali Bey by Burak Özçivit became a true symbol of the series, captivating millions of hearts with his unwavering honor and masculine charisma. This stately warrior with his legendary mustache turned into a living embodiment of the ideal knight of the Ottoman Empire, whose loyalty to the Sultan seemed absolute. However, beneath the glossy screen veneer lies a real historical figure, whose biography was far more complex and momentous than any script. Why did this brilliant hero suddenly disappear from the screen, leaving viewers utterly perplexed? Who was he really? A victim of forbidden love, or the greatest commander of his era? And what fate befell him after he left the capital? In this video, we will conduct a detailed investigation comparing fiction with archival facts. We will explore the origins of the ancient Malcochoglu clan, dissect his true military triumphs, and uncover how the legendary Bali Bey's life actually ended. Do you remember that moment when a rider with a piercing gaze and impeccable bearing first appears on the narrow streets of Istanbul? That was Malkoçoğlu Bali Bey. In a world where sultans fight for power and concubines for survival, he seemed like a breath of fresh air. He was the embodiment of honor, strength, and that rare masculine charisma that could even Hürrem Sultan momentarily lower her tone. But it is precisely with this character that one of the series' greatest oddities is linked. He simply vanished. Have you ever wondered why Bali Bey's departure from the plot left such an emptiness in viewers' hearts? After all, characters in the series died by the dozen. They were executed, poisoned, strangled with silk cords. But Bali Bey, he simply rode off into the sunset. No final battle, no tragic death in his beloved's arms. The show's creators were cruel. They deprived us of an ending, leaving us to guess what happened to him next. This cinematic device is called an open ending, but for millions of fans, it became genuine torment.
Bali Bey became more than just a historical character for us. He became a benchmark. Imagine a 16th century elite special forces soldier who possesses the manners of a diplomat and the heart of a romantic. Does that comparison seem exaggerated? Not at all. Bali Bey was the Sultan's cleaner. He solved problems that no one else could. He was Suleiman's shadow and his loyal shield. Yet here lies the central intrigue. If he was so important, why does his story break off mid-sentence? This is where the stakes begin to rise. We're used to trusting the screen, but what if I told you that the series showed only 10% of who this man really was? On screen, Bali Bey is constantly suffering, sometimes because of Elenika, sometimes because of his impossible love for the Crimean princess Aybige, and sometimes because of the persistent attention of Mihrimah Sultan. We see him as a man whose life is full of drama and disappointment. But was his real life truly so tragic? The question that torments everyone: where did he go after leaving Istanbul? Did he return to his ancestral lands to live out the rest of his days in solitude, or was he destined for a fate the screenwriters chose to keep silent about? In history, behind the sudden disappearance of an influential figure often lies either a disgraceful fall from grace or a secret mission not meant to be spoken of aloud. In Bali Bey's case, it's even more intriguing. Compare his character with other figures. Ibrahim Pasha was raised to the heavens and then cast into the abyss. Mustafa fell victim to intrigue. Bali Bey, however, stands apart. His departure from the palace looked like an escape from a gilded cage, but was it really an escape? The constant building of tension around his character created the illusion that something monumental awaited him around the next corner. Yet in the end, silence. And that silence gave birth to hundreds of myths. But the truth, as often happens, proves far grander than any script. The real mystery of Bali Bey lies not in why he left Istanbul in the series, but in who he was before he crossed the threshold of the Sultan's palace, and who he remained until his final breath. Are you ready to learn that the real Malcochoglu Bali Bey could crush his on-screen image with a mere snap of his fingers?
We are beginning our investigation. What if his real life was filled not only with the clashing of swords, but with political intrigues of such a level that Hürrem Sultan would seem like a mere novice in comparison? We are traveling into the past to find the true Malcochoglu, and a first surprise awaits you in his very lineage. When we watch the series, Bali Bey appears to us as a lone wolf. Yes, he has a family somewhere off-screen, but for the most part he acts alone. Yet the historical reality was far more impressive. Imagine not just an officer, but a member of one of the most powerful military dynasties in human history. To understand who Bali Bey was, you must first understand what the name Malcochoglu means. If we were to bring them into modern times, the Malcochoglu would not just be generals, they would be the owners of a massive private military corporation that has worked for the state for 200 years. This was a clan of hereditary warriors whose authority could sometimes rival that of the ruling Ottoman dynasty itself. Have you ever wondered why Sultan Suleiman trusted Bali Bey with his life and the peace of his harem? The answer is simple. That trust was forged over centuries. The Malcochoglu had served the Ottomans since the time of Sultan Bayezid I, and in all that time, not one of them had ever been accused of betrayal. This was a brotherhood of honor, where loyalty to the Sultan was passed down along with eye color and the shape of a saber. But who were they on the battlefield? Here we come to the most fascinating part. The Malcochoglu were leaders of the Akinjis. To put it simply, the Akinjis were the elite special forces and intelligence service of the Ottoman Empire rolled into one. They were light cavalry who knew no fear. They always rode ahead of the main army, were the first to storm enemy territory, sowing panic, and the last to leave the battlefield. The Akinjis received no salary from the treasury. War and plunder fed them. This made them incredibly effective, audacious, and very wealthy. Now imagine the scale. The Malcochoglu family effectively controlled the empire's borders in the Balkans. For European rulers of that time, the name Malcochoglu sounded like a death sentence. Can you imagine the weight of responsibility resting on our hero's shoulders? He wasn't just building a career, he was carrying the reputation of 10 generations of invincible ancestors. Every step he took was judged through the lens of his father Yahya Pasha's achievements and his grandfather's Malkoch Mustafa. In the TV series, Bali Bey is shown as a handsome guard of the royal chambers, but in reality, this was a man behind whom stood thousands of loyal swords and vast family estates. Sultan Suleiman didn't just bring a good-looking guy into his inner circle. This was an alliance with the most powerful military clan. This was high politics disguised as personal friendship. To be a Malcochoglu meant always living on the edge of a knife. On one hand, there was the boundless favor of the Sultan. On the other, the envy of other pashas who saw the clan as a threat to their influence. And here the question arises, how did Bali Bey manage to keep his balance? How did he remain one of them in the palace while being, in essence, an independent military baron? Many believed his position was unshakable. But history teaches us the opposite. The higher you soar, the harder you fall. And the Malcochoglu clan found itself on the brink of extinction more than once. What price did Bali Bey have to pay to ensure his family name continued to thunder across battlefields rather than getting lost in the dusty corridors of Topkapi? You think being a keeper of the royal chambers is the ultimate dream. In truth, for a man of Bali Bey's caliber, it was merely a lull before the real storm. And that storm was gathering on the horizon when Sultan Suleiman decided to march his army into the very heart of Europe. The year was 1526. Hungary, a thunderstorm, a swamp, and 2 armies frozen face to face. Here's a figure that might make your head spin. 2
Hours. That's all it took for the Ottoman army to annihilate the flower of Hungarian chivalry at Mohacs. 2 hours, and the map of Europe was redrawn from scratch. King Louis II, just 20 years old, drowned in a stream. Armor weighing nearly 40 kilograms offers no salvation when your horse stumbles into the mud and Ottoman arrows whistle all around. The outcome was predictable: the heavy cavalry of Europe versus the Ottoman horsemen, light as a morning breeze, and Bali Bay at the epicenter of the carnage. But let's get straight to the point. Why did anyone remember the name Malkoçoğlu Bali Bey among thousands of other commanders? The answer is simpler than it seems. He didn't just win, he broke the rules of the game. On the day of the battle, the Ottomans used a standard formation: janissaries with muskets in the center, heavy Sipahi cavalry on the flanks, and the vanguard, the light Akinji cavalry. Bali Bay commanded that vanguard, and here is where things get truly interesting.
The Hungarians launched their greatest pride into the attack. Heavily armored knights, steel tanks impenetrable from the front, but slow as turtles. Bali Bay pretended to be afraid. His Akinjis turned and fled. Blinded by the thrill of the chase, the knights charged forward, stretching their formation and losing control. Then Bali Bay opened his fist. His riders parted, and the Hungarians rode straight into the muzzles of Ottoman cannons. Grape shot from 300 meters away is no jousting tournament. Those who survived the barrage made it to the janissaries, and those who survived the janissaries realized with horror that Bali Bay's Akinjis had already circled behind them. The tactical maneuver known as the feigned retreat was not Bali Bay's invention. The steppe nomads had been using it 1,000 years before him, but he brought that technique to perfection. Imagine a jazz musician who takes someone else's melody and plays such a solo that the original is forgotten forever. That's Bali Bay for you. After Mohacs, Sultan Suleiman, who loved surrounding himself with talent, made an unexpected move. He did not send Bali Bay to conquer new lands. He did not give him an army for another campaign. Instead, he dragged him to the Topkapi Palace and appointed him keeper of the royal chambers. Sounds like a demotion, right? Outside, battles, glory. Inside, pillows, slippers, and handing the Sultan his water. But that's only for those who understand the mechanics of power. The Has Odabashi was no butler. He was the man physically closest to the Padishah's body. He enters the bedchamber when the Sultan wakes. He leaves last when the Sultan falls asleep. He hears every word whispered. He sees the faces of ambassadors as they leave the throne room, thinking no one is watching. In a world where information was more valuable than gold, Bali Bay became the owner of the most expensive asset, the Sultan's ears and eyes. And here's where it gets amusing. All the pashas and viziers who just yesterday looked at Bali Bay as a mere field commander suddenly start smiling, fawning, bringing gifts. Because they understand, if Bali Bay tells the Sultan that Ibrahim Pasha slept poorly and grumbled in the morning, that kills no one. But if Bali Bay whispers that such and such Beyler Bey is gathering troops supposedly for a campaign, but in reality, no need to finish that sentence.
The series presents us with Bali Bay as a finished product, a kind of superhuman who deftly juggles political intrigues while still finding time to shoot glances at beautiful women. But the real story of his rise was dirtier and more interesting. This guy had no margin for error, not a single one. One wrong word, and he wouldn't just lose his position, he would lose his head. In Topkapi, heads flew more often than at Mohacs, just more quietly, with fewer witnesses. So why did Suleiman trust him with that position? The answer is paradoxical. Bali Bay was inconvenient. He didn't belong to any clan faction. He wasn't a relative of a powerful vizier. He wasn't married to an influential pasha's daughter. He was a man from the battlefield, straightforward, unable to spin webs of lies, incapable of bribery. That's exactly the kind of man the Sultan wanted by his bedside, a man who had no reason to betray him. But here's a question rarely asked. What if this transparent warrior did have a secret after all? What if his heart beat not only for the Sultan and the empire? What if behind this titan stood a woman whose name the chroniclers chose to erase? And that woman cost him everything. Absolutely everything. In the series, Bali Bay is the embodiment of romantic tragedy. We see him as a man whose personal life resembles an endless battlefield where he suffers defeat after defeat. First, the loss of his beloved Eleni, then a soul-rending romance with the Crimean princess Ibij, and finally, the persistent, almost painful infatuation of young Mirimah Sultan, which he is forced to reject. The writers created the image of the eternal bachelor, a warrior whose heart is sealed so tightly in armor that no woman can stay there for long. But how close is this image to reality? Let's set the series aside for a moment and ask ourselves, could a high-ranking pasha, a representative of a great dynasty and the Sultan's right hand, truly remain a solitary wanderer? In the 16th century, the answer would be unequivocal: no. At that time, marriage was not just a union of two people, it was the primary political tool. To remain unmarried for a man of such status was like a modern president renouncing his citizenship. It's not just strange, it undermines trust in your stability. In real history, Bali Bay was not a lonely sufferer at all. On the contrary, he was married, and his marriage was so prestigious that the show's characters could only dream of such a match. His wife was Devlet Shah Sultan, the granddaughter of Sultan Bayezid II himself. Do you grasp the scale? Bali Bay didn't just serve the dynasty, he became part of it through marriage. He was the son-in-law, albeit a generation removed, of the ruling house of Osman. Now compare this to his on-screen portrayal. In the series, Bali Bay nearly loses his head over his feelings for Ibige Hatun. But in reality, his conflict was far more subtle and dangerous. Being the husband of a sultan's granddaughter is not only a great honor, it's also a gilded cage. Every step you take is under surveillance. Every word you utter is judged for loyalty not only to the ruler, but to the family. So why did the show's creators turn a high-status family man into a romantic rebel? The answer is simple. Ordinary human suffering sells better than dry political alliances. Viewers are far more interested in watching a hero agonize over unrequited love for Sultan Mirimah's daughter than in seeing him discuss taxes with his lawful wife in the quiet of a family estate. The on-screen Bali Bay became a victim of dramaturgy. He was stripped of his marital happiness to be given the aura of a mysterious lone hero. But did the real Bali Bay have any conflict? Absolutely, and that conflict was far greater than any harem gossip. It was a clash between his ambitions as a commander and his duties as a courtier. Imagine a man whose ancestors had, for centuries, decided the fate of the world on battlefields, and now he finds himself in Istanbul, where the main battles are fought not with sabers, but with whispers behind curtains. The real Bali Bay, like his on-screen counterpart, sooner or later must have felt that this air thick with incense and conspiracies was suffocating him. The closer he got to the Sultan, the more enemies he gained among those who considered themselves more worthy of that proximity. Was his departure from the capital a voluntary gesture of a proud warrior, or the result of the palace's pressure becoming unbearable? In the series, he leaves because honor commands it, but history hints at something else. When a man of such stature leaves the center of power, it is always either a great triumph or a hidden threat that lies behind it. So what really made him abandon the Sultan at the most critical moment? Was it an order from Hürrem, who saw him as an obstacle, or did Bali Bey realize something that made him turn away from the splendor of Topkapi forever? There came a moment when the air in the corridors of Topkapi became so thick with intrigue that it could almost be cut with a knife. We have reached the climax of Bali Bey's screen and historical destiny. In the series, this period turns into a real thriller. Hürrem Sultan, who had effectively become the shadow ruler of the empire, begins to see Bali Bey as a threat. He was too honest, too direct, and, most dangerously, too personally loyal to Sultan Suleiman himself, rather than to his powerful wife. For Bali Bey, this was a deadlock. Imagine a chessboard where you are a rook tasked with protecting the king, but the queen, Hürrem, is playing her own hidden game. In the series, the climax arrives when Hürrem disappears, and Bali Bey is the one burdened with finding her. If he fails to find the Sultan, he will be accused of negligence or treason. If he finds her, he will be dragged into depths of harem secrets from which no one returns alive. In the show, this period is depicted as the hero's emotional burnout. He finds Hürrem, but sees how intrigues turn noble warriors into executioners and love into a tool for blackmail. But what was happening behind the scenes of real history? Was Hürrem Sultan really weaving webs against Malcochoglu? Here we encounter a dramatic plot twist. In historical chronicles, there is no confirmation of any open enmity between them. On the contrary, for Hürrem, having such a loyal warrior by Suleiman's side was more a guarantee of stability. However, the point of no return in the life of the real Bali Bey did come, and it was far grander than any on-screen drama. Let's compare. In the series, Bali Bey leaves the service because his heart is broken and his soul is weary of Istanbul's snake pit. He returns to his homeland, to Semendire, as a man choosing retirement. But in history, his departure from the capital was not an end, but the beginning of his greatest triumph. In 1541, when Sultan Suleiman finally annexed Hungary to the empire, he needed a man to whom he could entrust the keys to Europe, and that man was Bali Bey. He was appointed Beyli Bey of Budin, modern-day Budapest. This was not just a governor's appointment. It was comparable to being made commander-in-chief on the empire's most dangerous and prestigious front. Budin was the Ottomans' shield against all of Christian Europe. Bali Bey traded the silk kaftans of Topkapi for heavy armor and left not to lick his wounds, but to build a new administration on conquered lands. Why did the series present his departure as a sad ending? Because for a melodrama, Miramah Sultan's tears as she watches him leave are more important than the logistics of supplying Hungarian fortresses. The writers made us believe that Bali Bey lost to palace intrigues and left the game. In reality, he had simply outgrown the level of palace corridors. What really happened to Bali Bey during his Hungarian exile, and was it actually exile at all? The end of the legend is near, and it doesn't resemble any script. Let's debunk the myths. The first and most popular, Bali Bey died young in battle. This is a beautiful legend that perfectly suits a romantic hero. We want to believe that such titans depart beautifully, at their peak of power, sword in hand. But reality was far more prosaic. To understand this, imagine a great athlete who, after decades of world records, simply retires and starts living a quiet life in the countryside. This strikes us as a tragedy of oblivion, doesn't it? In fact, the real Malcochoglu Bali Bey passed away in 1543. He outlived many of his enemies and even some of his friends. He died of natural causes, no longer the young, handsome man with jet-black mustache. And therein lies a unique tragedy of its own. The man who was the lightning bolt of the Ottoman army, whose voice made entire cities tremble, spent his final days in silence. But why didn't history embellish his death with as many details as the executions of Ibrahim Pasha or Mustafa? The answer may surprise you. In the Ottoman Empire, the death of a loyal warrior from natural causes was boring to chroniclers. Bali Bay fell victim to his own impeccable record. He was so loyal and so effective that his departure caused no political earthquake. He simply fulfilled his duty and closed his eyes. His final resting place is in Bursa, in the family mausoleum. This modest building is a silent witness to who he really was. Not a rebel, not an adventurer, but a deeply devout statesman who cared for his legacy. The tragedy of Bali Bay is not a tragedy of blood, but a tragedy of time. In the series, he remains eternally young, frozen in his perfect form. In history, however, he is a reminder that even the greatest heroes are only human. His quiet disappearance from politics after 1543 suggests that he was either seriously ill or consciously chose peace, understanding that his generation's time was passing. Suleiman's old guard was thinning, and Bali Bay was one of the last remnants of that bygone era, gradually pushed aside by gunpowder and cold calculation. Let's use the split-screen method. On the left, the on-screen Bali Bay, forever young, tormented by unrequited feelings, a lonely rider leaving the capital with a broken heart. On the right, the real Malcochoglu Bali Bay, a stern statesman, married for many years in an honorable union with a member of the dynasty, holding posts comparable to those of viceroys. In the series, he is a romantic symbol. In history, he is the foundation upon which the empire's border security rested. But here's the surprising part. The real magnitude of Malcochoglu Bali Bey's character is in no way diminished. On the contrary, the stakes in his real life were far higher. Being a dynastic son-in-law while remaining at the tip of the spear required not only courage but incredible diplomatic flexibility. If the screen hero fought for his love, the real Malcochoglu Bali Bey fought for the survival of his ancient lineage amid the fierce competition at court. And he won, leaving behind not only a mausoleum, but also a legacy that has not faded in 5 centuries. As we conclude our little investigation, I'd like to ask you, which version of Bali Bay feels closer to you now? The one who rode off into the unknown to melancholic music, or the one who for decades ruled Europe's borders with a steady hand, ensuring the greatness of his country?
The truth about Bali Bay turned out to be far more complex than just a story about leaving the service. It is a story of how a man can become a legend twice, once by his sword and once by the magic of cinema. Malkoçoğlu Bali Bey has passed into history, but his shadow still falls upon the walls of Topkapı, reminding us that true honor is subject neither to time nor to scripts. If you enjoyed uncovering the secrets of a great era with us, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Watch our other videos to find out what really happened to the rest of the heroes. Hit like, click the bell, and dive into the world of real history, which sometimes turns out to be far more compelling than any fictional series. See you in the next episodes.